to present initial scientific findings surrounding the object now known as the Bugosphere.
For a global mystery, a strange metallic sphere, now known as the Bugosphere, fell from the sky.
On March 2nd, 2025, a metallic orb roughly the size of a basketball literally fell out of the sky near Buga, Colombia, after a bizarre, zigzagging dance through the local power lines. José Luis Velázquez, a lead engineer from UNAM, was among the first to handle this seamless 2-kilogram mystery. But here is where it gets absolutely wild. While the surface looked primitive, the X-rays revealed a high-tech internal nightmare of quantum-grade fibers that shouldn't exist. But here is the real kicker. How does a simple ball of metal dodge high-voltage lines with the precision of a fighter jet? Fiery fall. March 2nd, 2025 was supposed to be a quiet Sunday in the Colombian countryside near Buga, but at exactly 3:15 p.m. local time, the sky decided to rewrite the rulebook of physics. Multiple civilians grabbed their phones to record what looked like a metallic basketball performing a high-stakes obstacle course through the local power lines. Here is the thing that really messed with the heads of everyone watching. This wasn't some tumbling piece of space junk or a failing drone, because the object was literally zigzagging with intentional high-speed maneuvers. It danced around the high-voltage wires with a precision that felt entirely calculated, and then, as if it simply reached its destination, it performed a controlled descent into the hills. Now, here is where it gets interesting for the people on the ground. A German tourist who happened to be hiking in the area was the first to reach the impact site, and he expected to find a smoldering crater, or at least some twisted metal. Instead, he found a seamless, 50-centimeter metallic orb sitting perfectly intact in the grass, as if it had been gently placed there by an invisible hand. Despite the incredible velocity seen in the videos, there wasn't a single dent, scratch, or scorch mark on the surface. It weighed roughly 2 kilograms and was covered in strange, etched symbols that didn't look like any language used on Earth today. The local authorities were on the scene fast, and once they realized this wasn't an explosive threat, the orb was handed over to a team of researchers who were already itching to get their hands on it. What would you actually do if something clearly not of this world landed in your backyard tomorrow? Would you call the police? Or would you be like these locals who were so fascinated they were practically leaning over it before the experts even arrived? The frenzy was absolute. And within hours, the Bugosphere was being prepped for transport to a high-security lab. But as the scientists stared at that smooth silver surface, they realized they were looking at a total dead end. There were no seams, no bolts, and no clear way to see what was powering those erratic maneuvers caught on camera. It was a basketball-sized mystery that felt like a solid hunk of metal, but the team knew better. Eyewitness accounts got the labs itching for answers. But if there was no visible power source, what exactly was waiting inside that metallic shell? X-ray shock. The moment the Bugosphere went under the scanner, the mystery stopped being about what fell from the sky and started being about the absolute insanity hidden inside that metal shell. Between May and July of 2025, José Luis Velázquez, an elite engineer at UNAM in Mexico, took charge of the analysis using industrial-grade CT scans. He wasn't just taking a quick look, he pushed the equipment to 330 kilovolts with a resolution of 50 microns, which is basically like looking at the orb under a digital microscope. What he found wasn't just a hollow ball, but a complex, 3-layered architectural nightmare that completely defied any known manufacturing process on this planet. Here is where it gets really weird. The outer shell was a precise 2-millimeter layer of seamless aluminium alloy, but the X-rays showed absolutely no welds, no rivets, and 0 assembly marks. It was as if the sphere had been grown rather than built. But wait, it gets even better. Inside that outer casing sat 2 more concentric layers housing 18 tiny microspheres that were perfectly spaced in a geometric orbit around a central core. That core looked like a microscopic chip-like structure, and when the team brought in sensitive sensors, they realized this chip was actually emitting a faint, decaying electromagnetic signature. Now, think about that for a second. You have a basketball-sized object that looks like a primitive relic on the outside, but inside, it has the guts of a quantum computer. Does seeing something like that beat every single expectation you walked into the lab with? Velázquez and his team were staring at uniform internal voids that were so precise they looked like they were carved with a laser that doesn't exist yet. ever cracked open something totally ordinary that hid absolute insanity inside? That was exactly what this felt like for the researchers at UNAM, but the most uncomfortable truth came when they looked closer at those 18 microspheres. They weren't just rattling around, they were suspended in what looked like a vacuum within the internal architecture, maintaining their positions with zero physical support. It was an impossible piece of engineering that suggested the guts of this thing were still partially active. Those layers hid internal wiring and fiber optic pathways that looked like they were pulled straight from a sci-fi lab, yet they were encased in an alloy that felt ancient. It was a staggering revelation that shifted the entire investigation from a simple UFO sighting to a deep dive into a piece of technology that seemed to defy the history books. The internal architecture was clearly functional, but if this technology really exists, who on Earth, or off it, was actually flying it? Fiber web. If the X-rays were the initial shock, the scanning electron microscope results were the moment the entire research team at UNAM had to sit down and catch their breath. When José Luis Velázquez and his colleagues zoomed in on the internal architecture of the Bugosphere, they didn't just find metal and air. They found a literal web of 52 optical fibers threading through those concentric layers like a high-tech nervous system.
So he unleashed a ton of information, but basically he claims that the metallic sphere found in Buga, Colombia, it's finally been decoded.
These weren't just random strands either. We are talking about pure silica cores with a diameter of only 8 to 10 microns, which is thinner than a human hair, but perfectly designed for high-speed data transmission. Here is the thing that really messed with the lab results. The purity of these fibers actually exceeded the highest manufacturing standards we have in the 2020s. Now, here is where it gets even crazier. The team discovered 31 microscopic holes on the inner shell, each one filled with a resin thread that matched the optical specifications of the fibers themselves. It wasn't just a hunk of metal, it was a functional device. They found tiny copper pins connecting the 18 microspheres in a complex network pattern that screamed communication system. These pins weren't just shoved in there, they were part of a data relay configuration that suggested this sphere was meant to process and send information. Could ancient wires like these carry signals that we barely even grasp today? Think about that for a second. What kind of forgotten network might be humming right under our modern noses without us ever knowing? But wait, it gets even weirder. When the researchers looked for any sign of wear or tear, they found absolutely nothing. Despite the claims that this thing had been exposed to the elements or sitting in the dirt for who knows how long, the fibers showed zero degradation. There was no clouding in the silica, no oxidation on the copper pins, and the resin in those microholes was as fresh as the day it was poured. It was an uncomfortable, undeniable truth that this wasn't just some hobbyist's project or a clever hoax. This was a piece of integrated circuitry that looked like it belonged in a quantum lab, yet it was wrapped in a seamless alloy that humans technically shouldn't have been able to forge so cleanly. That web of fibers wasn't just a random mess of guts. It was a deliberate, sophisticated architecture that wrapped around a central core, hiding a truth that would eventually force the scientists to look back into a history we thought we already knew. But what if that history is far more ancient than we ever dared to imagine? Impossible alloy. Now, here is the thing about that metal shell. It shouldn't actually exist. When the team at UNAM started running micro-hardness tests, they expected a standard aluminium alloy, but the results were absolutely staggering. The Vickers micro-hardness traverses showed a surface that was flawless and uniform all the way to the core, registering a Brinell hardness of 330 HB. For context, that is roughly 3 times harder than the high-strength aluminium we use in aerospace today. But wait, it gets weirder. There was literally zero porosity or the kind of microscopic inclusions you always find in earthly alloys. It was as if this metal had been forged in a zero-gravity vacuum where impurities simply don't exist. And get this, the composition was a precise mix of aluminium, 4.5% copper, and 1.2% magnesium, which sounds like something we could mix in a lab, but we can't replicate the way it was bonded. There are no welds, no casting seams, and no signs of industrial tools. But then, the researchers noticed the symbols etched into the surface. When they analyzed the grooves, they found traces of rare earth elements that seemed to have been fused into the metal post-manufacture. Now, here is where it gets truly bizarre. During the cleaning process, a few drops of water hit the surface and literally vaporized instantly. Even though the orb was sitting at room temperature, it was as if the alloy itself were rejecting foreign substances on a molecular level. Could a single leap in materials science like this rewrite our entire history of technology? How far back does the idea of an unbreakable, smart metal push the limits of what we think humans are capable of? We've always assumed that our ancestors were limited by stone and bronze, but this sphere suggests someone was playing with advanced metallurgy long before we ever discovered electricity. It's a material science wall that forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the timeline of our species. The hardness of the shell stunned every expert in the room, but it was the carbon dating results from the resin inside that dropped the real bomb on the scientific community. Time warp date. If the alloy tests felt like a wall, the carbon dating results were the wrecking ball that finally leveled the entire timeline of human history. To get a definitive age, researchers carefully extracted organic resin from those 31 microholes I mentioned earlier, and they sent 3 separate samples to the University of Georgia's Center for Applied Isotope Studies. When the results came back, the lab technicians literally had to run the tests again because the numbers made zero sense in the context of our modern world. All 3 samples returned a consistent date of 12,560 years ago, with a tiny error margin of only plus or minus 40 years. Think about that for a second. That date doesn't just predate the Great Pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. It places the creation of this high-tech orb exactly at the Younger Dryas boundary, which was a period of absolute global cataclysm. We are talking about 10,560 BC. The exact era many scientists believe a massive comet impact triggered a sudden ice age and wiped out whatever civilizations existed before us. It is an uncomfortable, undeniable truth that while our recognized ancestors were supposed to be just figuring out how to sharpen flint, someone was pouring organic resin into a quantum-grade metallic sphere. Ever wonder if those Ice Age folks were flying probes just like ours? Because here is the thing. The resin wasn't some synthetic plastic, but a complex organic compound that matches the era of the Younger Dryas perfectly. It aligns with the construction of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, another site that shouldn't exist according to the old history books. It makes you realize that lost civilizations might not just be myths. They leave calling cards like the Bugosphere to show us exactly what they were capable of before the world turned upside down. Now, here is where it gets even more intense. This age forces the lost civilization narrative right to the front and center, because you can't have a 12,000-year-old object emitting a decaying electromagnetic signature unless it was built with a level of power stability we are only just beginning to experiment with. We've always viewed the end of the last ice age as a primitive restart for humanity, but this sphere suggests it might have been a final, desperate transmission from a world that was about to be erased. The dating was the bomb that changed everything, but it was how those internal components aligned that raised the ultimate question: was this thing actually built for powered flight? Levitation hints. As the researchers moved from the X-rays to physical tests, things didn't just get weird. They started breaking the laws of physics entirely. Here is the thing that really kept the scientists up at night. The Bugosphere was literally fluctuating in weight while sitting perfectly still on a digital scale. One morning, it would register at its initial 2 kilograms, and by the afternoon, it would spike to nearly 10 kilograms. It was as if the orb were interacting with an invisible field we couldn't see. Or perhaps it was still trying to maintain some kind of internal equilibrium from a power source that was 12,000 years old. But wait, it gets even better. When the lab technicians tried to clean the surface with a damp cloth, the water would literally vaporize on contact, turning into steam instantly, as if the metal were sitting at 100 degrees Celsius. Now, here is where it gets interesting. The thermal sensors showed the orb was at a perfect ambient room temperature. There was absolutely no heat source detected, yet the water reacted as if it had hit a hot stove. According to the research logs by José Luis Velázquez at UNAM, this wasn't a thermal reaction at all, but some kind of high-frequency electromagnetic rejection.
And when radiology specialist Velázquez took a deeper look, trying to figure out what might be inside the ball making it cold, the sphere proved as uncooperative as possible.
The Gauss meter readings were dropping every single week, which points to a decaying electromagnetic field that has been slowly bleeding out since the moment it was recovered. It's an uncomfortable, undeniable truth that the field strength has been halving roughly every 30 days, but during one specific test involving a high-energy EM pulse, the sphere actually levitated 2 millimeters off the lab table for a few seconds. It wasn't a hoax or a trick of the light. The sensors caught a momentary anti-gravity or field propulsion remnant that suggested this wasn't just a probe, but a vehicle capable of active flight. Every legend about hovering orbs patrolling ancient skies suddenly starts to sound a lot more like a history lesson when you're staring at an object that defies gravity in a modern lab. What exactly decays when you start poking at ancient, dormant power sources? Are we accidentally draining the last bit of life from a 12,000-year-old battery? Or are we waking something up? The physics violations occurring in that room have basically sealed the case that this is a non-human artifact, at least by our current technical standards. Science is literally screaming at the experts to verify these results, but the skeptics are already pushing back hard, claiming that if this were true, it would change everything we know about our place in the universe. But if the proof is staring us right in the face, are we actually ready for the answer? Hoax or harbinger? Here is the thing about a discovery this massive: the bigger the claim, the harder the world pushes back. While the X-ray results and that 12,000-year-old date have sent shockwaves through the community, not everyone is ready to start rewriting the history books just yet. According to Julia Mossbridge, a psychophysicist and researcher known for studying anomalous phenomena, we have to be incredibly careful because modern fabrication techniques are becoming scarily good. She has flagged that while the internal architecture is insane, we absolutely need independent labs to verify these findings before we call it a non-human relic. Now, there is also the issue of how this story broke. People like Stephen Greer and Jamie Maussan jumped on the dating results almost immediately, sometimes even before the full data was released, which unfortunately flags a bit of a bias for the mainstream scientific community. It creates this tug-of-war between the believers who saw the levitation data and were ready to call it a probe from Atlantis, and the skeptics who are waiting for a peer-reviewed paper that hasn't actually been published yet. There are also valid questions about the chain of custody from that Colombian hillside to the lab in Mexico. But UNAM has kept a tight grip on the custody records, and they've already queued up the next phase of testing: isotope and neutron analysis. This will tell us once and for all if that aluminium alloy was forged on Earth or somewhere else entirely. Think about that for a second. How much proof would actually tip you from a skeptic to a believer? Is a 12,000-year-old quantum chip enough, or do you need to see the thing take off again? It's an uncomfortable truth, but right now we are in a waiting game. The verdict hangs in the balance, but those X-ray guts are screaming that we've fundamentally misunderstood our own past. 12,000 years ago, someone built a quantum-grade sphere with fiber optic guts and a seamless shell that still hums today. Is it a lost civilization's probe or a modern hoax? Drop your thoughts below. Ciao.